Thank you very much. So first off, I'd like to thank Professor Radcliffe for inviting me here, and the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication for giving me this opportunity, and for all of you, or since I'm now in the South, all of y'all, for coming here and listening to this talk. I've never been to Oregon before, so it's been a really fantastic 40 hours, and I really wish I had more time to hang out. Before I get started, just I guess a little bit of who I am and how I got to be standing here today. Like Professor Radcliffe said, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Media Studies. I'm a fellow this semester at the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and also a fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. I got my PhD at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and for those of you interested in graduate school, it's a phenomenal place to be. And like Professor Radcliffe said, I am also the author of this book for the low, low price of $25.99 on Amazon. It makes a wonderful St. Patrick's Day gift, or Easter, or really any time you want to surprise your sweetheart about local media policy. You would be surprised the amount of times someone wants to surprise their sweetheart about local media policy. So a little bit of confession here is that I'm actually not a journalism scholar. I'm a scholar of media law and policy. So I come at this question of local news and local journalism and local information from this kind of circuitous route. And I'm really interested in the book about the types of regulatory mechanisms we have that govern local media, and how policymakers and lawmakers think about this question of what does it mean to be local in the digital age. And kind of spoiler alert is that they actually don't think a whole lot about it. So that's how I came to this topic of being interested in local news and information, and what we might be calling like local media ecosystems, right? How the different local media in a particular community interact with each other. Today, like Professor Radcliffe said, though, I'm going to be talking specifically about newspapers, and even more specific than that, small market newspapers. Those newspapers that service the smaller communities in the United States. And this is building off research that Professor Radcliffe and I have done over the past year at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism. And I want to start off just by quickly answering the question, why study small market newspapers, right? And I'll get into a little bit of more detail later on. But for the moment, the most important thing to understand is that small market newspapers, which are newspapers that we've defined as being with a circulation of under 50,000 a day or a week, represent 97% of all newspapers published in the United States. Right? Like, that's bananas. So there are 7,071 regularly published newspapers in this country, daily or weekly, right? 6,851 of those have a circulation of less than 50,000. Right? So this is substantial, right? This is not just a small proportion of newspapers. This is a silent majority. And one of the things that we discovered is that when we talk about the newspaper industry, right, we tend not to think about small town papers. We tend to think about, how the metro newspapers are doing. Spoiler alert, not very well, right? Philadelphia Inquirer, the Charlotte Observer, the Boston Globe. We tend to think about what the national newspapers are doing and how they're innovating, right? The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. And then we also think about, when we think about the news industry more broadly, kind of those digital interlopers, right? BuzzFeed, Vice, Huffington Post. And when it comes to the industry in general, we're getting one particular narrative. And the narrative is, like most things, well summarized by The Simpsons.
But I've always been terrible!
With me here to comment on today's Democratic debate is Andrea Crowley of CNN, Demont Evans of Slate.com, and Ron Lahar, a print journalist from the Washington Post.
Your medium is dying.
Nelson.
But it is.
There's being right and there's being nice.
Right? So this is the narrative that we're exposed to, which is your medium is dying. Right? Print is dead. The newspaper industry is dead. And what I kind of want to argue today is that that is only half the story. In fact, that's not even half the story, right? Because when we think about papers with titles like the Calhoun County Journal and the Akron Hometowner or the Franklin Favorite or the Quincy Herald Whig, we really don't know a lot about these papers, right? And they really don't fit into this category of your medium is dying. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to argue that we as researchers and practitioners and industry watchers and students, we need a more nuanced language to speak about newspapers, right? And grouping all newspapers into a kind of single, monolithic, homogenous industry, as is often the case with a lot of the reports we read, or even The Simpsons, right? Your medium is dying. It suggests a homogenous experience. It suggests that all newspapers are going through the exact same thing at this moment. And this is not the case. Right? So smaller publications face their own set of challenges and opportunities, and they define success and innovation in different ways. Right? And so much to the fact that it may not even be worthwhile speaking of the newspaper industry as a whole anymore. Because it's really not one industry. It's multiple, right? Since small market newspapers are really emerging as kind of this new form, this new aspect of a media product than kind of their metro and regional counterparts. So to make this argument, though, I'm gonna walk us back a couple of steps. I wanna start off by just painting some context here of what is going on in the newspaper industry. Talk about how we define a small market newspaper. What do we know about small market newspapers to date? And for those of you interested in kind of the critical theory aspect of newspapers and news, I want to kind of walk us through what exactly a newspaper does for us. What are its social functions? I want to talk about the method that we used to ask or to answer our research questions when we got to this project, and talk about 4 findings. That we have ideas of optimism, ideas of place, ideas of technology, and ideas of journalism. And this is how we got to this kind of larger argument that we need a more nuanced language to talk about newspapers, because thinking that all newspapers that are going through the exact same thing as the New York Times really does a disservice to smaller titles. And along the way, if anyone has any questions or comments or anecdotes about your own experiences with small market newspapers, please don't hesitate to let me know, because I hope that we can really get into a discussion. So what do we know about newspapers? Right? This is where it gets depressing. Right? We've learned the latest Pew State of the News Media report says that in the last 20 years, the industry has shed 39% of its workforce, right? 20,000 jobs. Circulation fell 7% in 2015 alone. Advertising fell 8% in 2014, 2015, making it the worst year for advertising revenue for newspapers since the Great Recession of 2009. And these are not great statistics. They get even worse when we look at the amount of newspapers that have closed in recent years. Pew, again, suggests that 100 newspapers closed between 2004 and 2015. The Waldman report, which was this kind of comprehensive report published by the Federal Communications Commission in 2011 on the information needs of communities, had listed 245 titles that closed between 2007 and 2010. And Penny Abernathy and her team at UNC Chapel Hill found 664 titles that closed between 2004 and 2014. So we've got some discontinuity here about how many newspapers have closed, but suffice to say a number have, right? And I highlight these differences to also demonstrate that it's really difficult to tease apart these numbers, right? Where are these titles? Who are these titles, right? Are they the second paper in a market, for instance, like the Seattle Post-Intelligencer or the Rocky Mountain News? Or are they the only news voice in the community? These are a lot of questions that we don't know. And this is why it becomes really difficult to tease apart. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you know if this meant just their print product or if they like closed entirely.
That's another excellent question. These two are the print product. This one is both like either they've closed the print product or they've significantly downscaled. They moved from a daily to a weekly, for instance. That's how they're considered closed. So that's why that number gets kind of alarmingly high. So that's an excellent, excellent question. Right. So teasing apart these numbers is difficult, and it gets more difficult when you try and drill down into this kind of granular data about small market newspapers. Right. We don't know a lot about the changes at small papers versus large papers. But what do we know about small market newspapers? Well, like I said, we define a small market newspaper as a daily or weekly print publication with a circulation of less than 50,000. And I'm more than happy to get into how we developed this number. There's a whole methodology around it that I don't want to get into right now, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to do that. Editor and publisher suggests that there are 7,701 daily and weekly newspapers, like I said, of which 6,851 have a circulation of under 50,000. So this is really a silent majority of newspapers in the United States. 97% of newspapers, in fact. So the argument being that we're probably hearing the narrative of the top 3% and not the other 97%. So it suggests, again, not a missing middle, but a silent majority. What else do we know about small market newspapers? And this is where it gets particularly vexing. So I gave you statistics from Pew about the newspaper industry as a whole. We do not have statistics about small market newspapers. We haven't had them since about 2009, when their major organization, the National Newspaper Association, stopped collecting these figures. Right. What we've got from 2008 is we know that small market newspapers weathered the Great Recession much better than their metro or national counterparts. They weathered the crisis of journalism far better. So in 2008, for instance, metro dailies saw an average revenue decline of about 15%, while small markets were 2%. Right? We also know that fewer non-dailies closed between 2004 and 2014 than dailies. So it was the dailies that were really suffering, not so much the weekly publications. Right? So we know, or we think we know, that these small market newspapers have weathered the crisis better than their metro or national counterparts. But teasing out this information is really difficult. Just out of curiosity, does anybody here have a newspaper subscription? Holy smokes, this is awesome. When I ask this of my class in the University of Virginia, no one raises their hand. So it's very encouraging. Yeah. So what else do we know about newspapers? You guys are scholars of newspapers, newspaper practitioners, so you know this. So I will screen through this stuff and get to the meat. But in my view, newspapers perform three essential social functions. There's a democratic function, there's a community function, and there's an ecosystem function. When we think about what do newspapers contribute to democracy, right? The classic one is that they're the watchdog. They're the fourth estate. Right? The accountability journalism, the investigative journalism, they keep power accountable. They also provide us with what's called the information needs of communities, the information we need to go about our daily lives as citizens and as consumers and as members of a community. If, for those of you who are media studies majors, you might have heard the idea of agenda setting theory, right? They set the agenda. So newspapers, classically, they tell us not what to think, but what to think about. What are the important topics that we should be thinking about and talking about? So again, for those of you who may have taken the media studies classes, the agenda setting function. And there's also a body of literature that suggests that reading the newspaper contributes to greater civic engagement and voter turnout, which is a really interesting connection here. And so the more you read the newspaper, the more likely you are to vote, the more likely you are to contact your local representative or go to a town hall meeting or something like that than if you're not. Right. Newspapers are also essential at creating kind of community integration and identity. Right? what does it mean to be a member of or a resident of Eugene? What does it mean to be a student at the University of Oregon, right? There's this integration function that newspapers contribute to, for better or for worse, because when you talk about forming a community, you're also talking about who's not included, who's excluded from this community. And newspapers also do that. They also exclude. So we can't forget that. But there is this integration function, and this is particularly true for immigrant communities. Right? There's some great historic literature, Robert Park in 1922 and Janowitz in 1952, who talked about how immigrant communities to the United States used the newspaper to assimilate, right? To try and figure out what is it like, what is American life like. So this, and we see this up until studies more recently, where immigrant communities continue to rely on the newspaper in order to figure out, or in order to integrate themselves into daily life. Newspapers can also be, in this kind of community function, the champions of the community and add some boosterism. And they also position themselves as this kind of connection between the local and the global. So they take these global events and localize them for us and help us contextualize where do we fit in these kind of larger global conversations. There's a body of literature, and this was particularly important for Damien and I, that say that when readers of small-town newspapers, they don't necessarily want these newspapers to always be watchdogs. They also want them to be good neighbors, right? They want them to be looking for solutions and offering solutions and not just pointing out problems. Right? So this is kind of the good neighbor phenomenon. And lastly, they do provide a sense of place, right? They turn a space into a place and something that we can relate to and in. So this is what I would call the community function of newspapers. And like I said, there's also this ecosystem function. Right? A lot of times for these smaller town papers, they're the only news voice in the community. A great example here is the Calhoun County Journal in Bruce, Mississippi. Is anyone from Mississippi? Has anyone ever been to Mississippi? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, five. I've never been to Mississippi, but I had these great conversations with the Calhoun County Journal. And they're the only news voice in Calhoun County, Mississippi, population 14,000. Right? So that's incredibly important. And even when they're not the only news voice, newspapers continue to do the bulk of original reporting. Right? So somewhere between 48% and 85% of all original reporting in a community is done by the newspaper and then picked up by other media. Like, this is incredibly important. So when we think about, when we do studies on what happens when the newspaper closes, right? That's a tremendous amount of original reporting that isn't done anymore. And as much as we can say, oh yeah, well the hyperlocal blogs will just pick it up, right? Well, these hyperlocal blogs haven't been picking it all up and don't usually exist in smaller communities. Right? Sure, they'll exist in Seattle, where the Seattle Post and Intelligencer are closed, but they don't exist in Calhoun County. So this is why Rasmus Klein-Nielsen of the Reuters Institute at Oxford University says that newspapers may no longer be mainstream media. So we don't really consume a lot of newspapers anymore, right? And maybe not mainstream media, but what they are keystone media, because they provide the bulk of reporting for other media outlets. So these are the social functions of newspapers, and just kind of setting the stage for why this conversation is still really important. And so drawing on this, reading all this literature and thinking about the value of newspapers and realizing that we don't know a lot about small town newspapers, Professor Radcliffe and I developed 2 research questions, kind of deceptively simple research questions, right? What is the state of small market newspapers in the United States? And second, how are small market newspapers responding to the challenges and opportunities of digital technology? These are the 2 kind of reigning kind of narratives about the newspaper industry. 1, right, your medium is dying. 2, print is dying. So how are they responding to these changes in digital technology? And for those of you interested in research design, well, you all should be interested in research design, in terms of method, right? We did this in 2 phases. We got to these questions in 2 phases. The first was a series of in-depth interviews. So we interviewed 60 60 respondents, 60 experts in the field of local newspapers and local news, right? And these interviews ranged anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. And we talked to owners and publishers and editors. We talked to senior executives of some of the major newspaper chains like McClatchy and Gannett and Hearst. We talked to managing editors at major daily newspapers. We talked to editors and publishers and journalists at small market newspapers. We talked to editors and publishers and reporters at hyperlocal online news organizations. We talked to researchers and think tanks and funders and foundations, policymakers, industry watchers, basically anyone and everyone who would talk to us about small market newspapers, we talked to. Right. And then drawing on these conversations, we developed a survey. Right? A survey for reporters and editors at small market newspapers, and we got 420 responses, which is nothing to scoff at. That's pretty significant. So the results of our survey, they might not be comprehensive, but they're certainly indicative of what's going on. And we actually got a rather wide geographic distribution from our survey. Right? So it wasn't just, okay, Oregon newspapers and Virginia newspapers who are the ones talking to us. It was newspapers in, all of these locations. So we have a nice kind of understanding of the state of small market newspapers in the country. So again, may not be conclusive, right? As qualitative researchers, we can never talk about causality, but it's certainly indicative of these trends that are going on. So from these different phases, we developed 7 themes of what's going on in the industry, 4 of which I want to share with you today. The sense of optimism. There's this connection to place. There's what's going on with technology. And there's the changing nature of local journalism kind of in general. And I want to walk us through kind of each of these and share some of the really exciting conversations that we had that led us to developing this argument that we need a more nuanced conversation to talk about newspapers. Because again, that master narrative conversation is not working anymore, if it ever worked at all. So probably the most surprising aspect of our research came with this level of optimism, or at least not pessimism, about the small market newspapers. Right? Again, challenging the doom and gloom narrative that we've been hearing for years, decades. And this didn't begin though from a sense of naivete amongst our respondents. It's not like someone was saying, "Oh my God, we're doing amazing, we're making all this money." Well, there's not a ton. Most respondents began by noting that the industry is facing challenges, right? So someone said it's pretty damn depressing. Someone else said it's precarious, and someone else said that the short answer is grim. But when we asked them to kind of drill down into their immediate experiences, not talking about the newspaper industry as a whole, but what's going on at their paper, right? The tone often changed from this kind of grim, precarious, glum to one of some guarded optimism. So here's a quote from the executive editor of the Daily Coloradoan in Fort Collins, Colorado. So she says, "Our paid circulation is up year over year and is up over the last 2 years. And I love to point out that because so often we do hear local news is on its way out and it's a dying industry. And yet here in Fort Collins, we've got more people paying for our product, our news, than we did a year ago. We have more people paying for that news today than we did 2 years ago. And we have among the highest digital-only subscriber base in our company, and that company is Gannett." So this is pretty significant, that when we look at the experiences of the papers individually, that they're not reflective of this master narrative of your medium is dying. And this was also reflected in the survey that we did in 2 questions. So one of the questions we asked is, how secure do you feel in your job? And another question we asked is, how positive do you feel about the future of local newspapers? And 50% of our respondents, right, indicated that they felt either very secure or quite secure in their job. Not insignificant, so half, right? Now, the reason this could be significant is because there's a company called CareerCast, which ranks, the top 200 careers in, the United States. Newspaper reporter is 200 out of 200. 199, I believe, is loggers, and 198 is broadcast journalist. So, and why is it that newspaper reporters are 200 to 200? A lot of it is job security, right? So our kind of findings maybe challenge that a little bit. The other one is, how positive do you feel about the future of local newspapers? 61% of our respondents were very positive or slightly positive about the future of small market newspapers. So not conclusive, but it does challenge that narrative that we've been hearing. So why is it? Why is it that we've got this sense of optimism? So we investigated this a little bit, and we came up with a couple of explanations for why there is this sense of guarded optimism. The first one being that people still pay and read newspapers, right? You guys all still pay and read newspapers, either in their printed product or their digital iteration, right? And this comes from this quote here again is from my favorite interview in Calhoun County, where Joel McNeese, the publisher, says that our citizens rely on us for services that we would never think about. I think a lot of people, a lot of non-newspaper people don't realize they take for granted the role that the newspaper plays in the community. So in this community, for instance, people call up the newspaper for a phone number or for directions or for, what restaurant is open. Right? So this newspaper becomes the Google of Bruce, Mississippi. Right? Like I said, another reason for optimism is that oftentimes they're the only news voice in the community, right? Which is not insignificant. They also tend to move at a different pace, right? So the experience for many metro dailies and national newspapers is quite different. They face a lot more competition, right? Not only for eyeballs, but for advertising, which I guess is also eyeballs, right? And so there's reduced competition, which has allowed small market newspapers to learn from their metro and daily counterparts in a way that the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Charlotte Observer never had the chance to have these learning opportunities because they were really faced with challenges. Craigslist, right? Was one of a major challenge. And we heard this actually from John Costa, editor-in-chief of Oregon's Bend Bulletin, right? He says, we're not a big metro area. We're not in a big metro area. So we have been free from a lot of that pressure. And so just kind of indicative of kind of the quotes we heard. Another reason why they've got this sense of optimism is this idea of the daily or weekly model. Newspapers, says one of our respondents, have a better chance to tell the whole story because, especially at a weekly paper, you're not on this sunrise to sundown deadline, right? So you've got a little bit more time to tell the story. And you do have that luxury if you're the only news voice in the community, right? But because they can experiment with different publishing models a little bit more, they've got this leeway. And we are seeing, like those early statistics showed, a lot of newspapers are moving from a daily model to a weekly model. And then, of course, there is also this idea of reputation and heritage. Right? These small market newspapers have been around for a long time. Right? Yesterday, I had the privilege of having a beer with the publisher of the Register and Guard, who was saying that the newspaper here has been around for 150 years. Like, that's not that much shorter than the existence of the University of Oregon. Right? Now, that's significant. And because of this, newspapers are able to capitalize on this longevity. And that means a lot in an age of kind of digital fly-by-nights. Right? There's a trust embedded here that shouldn't be discounted. So these were some of the reasons for this optimism. Right?
Question.
Yes.
So you sat down with the publisher, the Register Guard, did they at all talk about like the downsizing that's happening currently?
We talked a little bit about that, yeah. We talked about the opportunities that can happen. We talked about, are there areas that need to be cut, or and are there areas that can be expanded? So it was a great conversation, and the publisher is sitting 3 rows down from you. So I'd strongly recommend, an opportunity to have a Q&A. It's right over there. It was a great conversation. So there's a sense of optimism. There's also this connection to places, right? Believe it or not, human beings tend to live their lives in places. As much as we talk about this kind of idea of global cosmopolitanism and living on planes and social media and the Facebooks and the Snapchats, We still live our life in. Right? So this was something else that was pretty significant for us. So we found that the most successful small market newspapers were the newspapers that brought people together physically in a room, having a conversation, hosting events, right? Events to talk about community issues, hosting local award shows to celebrate the community, fostering roundtables to talk about what readers want from the newspaper, and also opening up their editorial meetings to people in the community. Right? So really fostering this idea of place, which is something that they have that a lot of digital kind of placeless media don't, right? Where is the Huffington Post located? Where is BuzzFeed located? Where is Vice located, right? I mean, we can say New York, but not really. Vice, by the way, for those of you who don't know, started in Canada, and this is very important because I am Canadian. So we're just going to claim that. So this idea of bringing people together, and here's a quote again from the Daily Coloradoan, right? So their executive editor says, "We're a small newsroom, and we've decided that engagement is so important to us, we created a 10-person engagement team, and that engagement team includes folks who are charged with communicating when talking with readers across any of the platforms that we operate on and that our readers operate on, but also thinking about how we connect with people in the real spaces. So that means in the event space. Is the community connecting around what we are doing to further our relationship with our readers in a meaningful way? How can we demonstrate to them the value of a local news organization and that it goes beyond the printed product?" So this is a way that newspapers can communicate this. So just a couple of examples of what's going on at the Daily Coloradoan. They do like secret supper clubs where they bring people together for a mystery meal, whiskey tastings, on top of doing like the more kind of political, hard-hitting, what's going on in our community sort of conversation. So again, it's about bringing people together. Right? And I would be remiss if I said that this is not done independently of what we would think about as the political economy of the industry. Right? Newspapers are able to make money doing this. They can sell sponsorships to these events. They can sell admission to these events, right? One respondent noted that his paper makes between $500,000 and $750,000 a year just doing events. That's significant at a small town paper, right? Another one of our respondents, Jim Brady from Billy Penn. Some of you might have heard of it. It's a kind of digital news site in Philadelphia. Defines his entire business strategy around events and low overhead. And so it's a new opportunity for these small market newspapers to make money. Right? Yeah.
Do these individuals worry about the ethicality of like mixing their sponsorships and the editorial side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are. I'm going to get to that about talking about some of the challenges, but there is this kind of cognitive dissonance, right? Between what does it mean to offer solutions? So being kind of challenging that traditional objective ethos that we hear about from J schools, right? But then also there is kind of a general recognition, for better or for worse, that the editorial and promotional sides are blurred, right? And a lot of our respondents just happen to say that this is how it is. There's more anxiety about actually the advocacy or solutions journalism, I think, than the second part. Some are even saying, if you're going to be a digital startup, and doing kind of hyper-local online news, you have to learn how to be a business person because you're often the only person. So I think they're aware that there still needs to be a divide, but that divide is not as church and state as it was 20 years ago. And I think that's something we're hearing in the literature as well, again, for better or for worse. And I'll get into a little bit more about that when I talk about some challenges. Excellent question. You're really on point today. That's awesome. You might be on point every day, but we just met, so.
It's special.
All right, I appreciate that. So the third theme I want to talk about is the question of technology, right? So we talked about optimism, that there's a sense of optimism. We talked about places, bringing people together. And now this idea of technology. And I think that anecdotally, I think we tend to maybe mock small town newspapers, right? They're kind of backward, maybe parochial. When it comes to technology, they might be hopelessly analog. And sometimes this is not incorrect. Many of the papers we spoke with, their websites are just a static PDF or a scan of the newspaper. and their ads on their website are literally just scanned business cards. So it's a old school. It's a 1994 website. But on the flip side of this, in our research, both in our interviews and in our survey, we encountered also a community really eager to learn and really eager to experiment with new technology. And this is in addition to having this kind of robust social media presence on Facebook or Instagram and Slack. Many are also using video and live video, right, to complement existing reporting. And if they're not doing this, many are keen to learn about video and podcasting, for instance. So this is one of the questions we had from our survey. Do you use any of the following? So video reporting, 84% of our respondents said they used video. 67% said they did live video. 25% said podcasts. And the really interesting one for me is this one. 4.69% of our respondents, 4.69% of 420 said they took advantage of virtual reality. Like, that is super cool. So I want to highlight two examples here. One, of course, comes from my favorite, Bruce, Mississippi, and the Calhoun County Journal, which is a weekly newspaper with a circulation of a little bit over 5,000. Right? Like I said, it's the only news voice in Calhoun County, Mississippi. And the journal, the Calhoun County Journal, is incredibly active on Instagram. Right? And incredibly active on Vine, although not so much anymore, as Vine doesn't exist. And where they're finding a lot of audience on Instagram is high school football games, right? So they're kind of playing the long game here. They're saying, how can we get high schoolers really engaged with the newspaper, knowing that they're not going to subscribe to the newspaper right away, right? But how do we get them being excited about their photo being on the newspaper's Instagram feed? Right. And then maybe when they've settled in the community, then getting a newspaper subscription. So it's, again, this is like a long game of 10 years. And I think it speaks to the fact, though, that it is still exciting to see your name and your picture in a newspaper, right? Like I clip things out, or I print things off if I'm in a paper. So there's still something significant here. This product, and it hasn't actually produced any results yet, but the publisher is optimistic. Another example comes from here in Oregon, in Klamath Falls. Has anyone ever been to Klamath Falls? Oh, hey, oh wow, all right, a bunch. That was very enthusiastic. Are you from Klamath Falls?
No.
No. Okay.
No, but I coordinate an internship program here where we send interns there, and I know what you're about to say. They're doing great stuff.
It's super cool, right? Yeah, so they partnered with the local community college to produce augmented reality segments. They do it once a week, augmented reality for their newspaper subscribers. And what happens is that you download kind of a QR reader on their app, and you're able to hover your phone on the newspaper, and a kind of augmented reality segment pops up. So for instance, they did this for the Babe Ruth Little League World Series, where you could hover your phone around a picture of one of the players, and then up would pop an augmented reality baseball card on your phone. And yeah.
Like a hologram?
Not a hologram, no. But just, it would be more, it's a little bit more interactive. So yeah, I don't have so you could take your phone and just hover it, and then on the screen would pop up a baseball card.
Oh, okay.
And so that's maybe the difference between virtual reality, which is a little bit more immersive, and just kind of augmented reality. It augments the experience of the newspaper. And so they do this once a week. And it's been a successful partnership. The editor, the executive editor there, was telling us that it took their readers a little bit of time to get used to it. But in the end, they found some positive results. And it's a new way, as they say, for newspapers to attract new audiences and give readers more information. It's also like a fairly low stakes situation because you're teaming up with a community college, but a potentially high reward. I mean, this is super cool. At a newspaper, right? Love it. But of course, we're also told that, like I said, there's also those newspapers who are struggling because this is also, even if it's low stakes, it's still a resource commitment, right? You still have to designate time and some money to make these things happen. Right, so here's the testimony of a respondent who was a little bit more skeptical. And this was a particular conversation about going on Facebook, having an active profile on Facebook. So this respondent said, "We've got 7 full-time staffers here, and we've got our hands full. And to pick someone and say, oh, by the way, you're going to spend over half your day doing the website, I've got to see some money. I just got to see cost-benefit analysis because everybody here is a hard worker. They're good folks, and I'm not going to divert them unless I see some money." Right? So our respondents are not saying that the print medium is going to survive forever. It probably won't. But they're also not willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. So the last thing I want to talk about, because I realize I'm running out of time here, which is that this idea of it might be time to rethink what local journalism actually is. I've already talked about how, in addition to their watchdog role, small town newspapers, perform the ability of being a good neighbor, right? And they look for solutions to community problems. And this, of course, is a departure from traditional journalism's detached mode that we've become very familiar with, particularly at metro newspapers. But at small market newspapers, this is something that they've always done. Right? They've always done this kind of solutions journalism, or what used to be called public journalism, or used to be called civic journalism, for any of you who have done the history of journalism. Right? So several of our respondents noted that part of their mandate is to be actively situated in the community and to improve their community, or at least support those who do. Right? So this is a quote from a executive at Gannett who said, "I think the concept of objectivity gets distorted over time. That because something that removed journalists so much from their communities that they covered, that it actually drove a wedge in that relationship. And to pretend that you can't, or pretend that you don't live in a community that you cover and that you're not affected by the events that you're reporting on and that you have a stake in them, it's ludicrous. And readers, even if they don't articulate that, sense it and are turned off by it." So this is a respondent who's really saying that reporters need to be members of the community and need to be invested in this community. Right? But then, of course, like our colleague pointed out here, others recognize that there is some cognitive dissonance here, right? That can take this kind of activist or solutions journalism can take on. One respondent said that there's a fear of leaving objectivity and the fear of activism in journalism. So that's something that these newspapers are trying to reconcile right now, is how to mix that kind of watchdog role with that good neighbor role. Just to kind of, as an aside, one of the questions that we asked in our survey was if the respondent could define this word engagement. Engagement is kind of this industry buzzword, right? Like, you can't go to a newspaper conference without hearing about the word engagement. But we could ask, what the hell does engagement mean? And a lot of our respondents actually took affront at being asked this question, because for them, this is something they've always done. It's not new, right? They've always been part of this kind of engaged community. So this is just kind of a selection of some gems here, right? Engagement is a $5 word dreamed up by overpaid consultants trying to sell newspapers on what they're already doing, reporting on the lives and concerns of everyday people in their communities. Someone else just wrote, "It's meaningless bullshit." Someone else said, "A meaningless term handed down by our clueless corporate overlords that no self-respecting journalist would use." So, I mean, these were not the majority, but there was certainly a plurality of respondents who said, like, hey, we already do this. Stop telling us something we already do. Right? So this is important stuff, right? But of course, newspapers can't do it all anymore. They can't. And one of the things that we heard when we asked people, like, what can you do? What some of the best practices that you have? And one is to try and pick, what are the 4 or 5 master narratives of your community and own those narratives. These are your beats. Right? Can't do it all anymore. As one of our respondents said, what is your Statue of Liberty? And does anyone know the relationship between newspapers and the Statue of Liberty? Joseph Pulitzer. So Pulitzer campaigned in his newspaper for New York to, construct the Statue of Liberty, because I got shipped over from France in boxes, right? But there was no money. So this was his solutions journalism. We got to build the Statue of Liberty. What is your Statue of Liberty? And someone else simply said, you can't do everything, but you can do anything. And this is something to keep in mind, I think, for the new iteration of local journalism, is that there's going to be areas where you have to cut, where you can't print it. Maybe it's the bridge column, right? We talked about this yesterday, the bridge column in newspapers. Maybe that's something that you have to give up. But maybe because of that, it frees up space to do something else. A really cool partnership going on in my hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia, is between the Daily Progress, which is the newspaper in Charlottesville, and Charlottesville Tomorrow, which is a nonprofit, not partisan, hyperlocal news site that focuses specifically on civic politics and zoning issues and K through 12 education, so basically not the University of Virginia. And right now, because of this partnership, Charlottesville Tomorrow accounts for about 60% of all of the civic governance coverage in the Daily Progress, which is a really interesting partnership. There's no money that crosses hands, but it's a content sharing arrangement. So that is pretty cool. So far I've outlined the successes of small market newspapers, and if not some of the successes, at least points of departure. But there are also challenges, and I'm going to scream through these because I am taking up a lot of your time. But if we all recognize that time and money are the two biggest challenges for newspapers, large and small, what are some of the other challenges that they're facing? Well, staffing. Right? We talk about newspapers hemorrhaging reporters, but a lot of times we heard from some of these small market newspapers that they're having problems recruiting young talent, recruiting and retaining young talent, because it's difficult to pitch and sell a small town, right? So this is certainly a problem. Another problem is ownership models, right? We're seeing a concentration of the newspaper market. And by concentration, I mean we've got a company like Gannett who owns something like 250 newspapers, 149 of which are non-dailies. They own a ton of small market newspapers. You've got Newhouse that owns 438 newspapers. So we're seeing the concentration of the industry. And is that a benefit in that you can have best practices and streamline news copy editing, and you can have a fancy website? But is that also creating the homogenization, right? Is something being lost when the owner is no longer embedded within the community? Hedge funds are another interesting model. Warren Buffett's BH Media Group, for instance, went on a buying spree in 2013 and said, hey, there's life and there's money in small town newspapers, and now they're backing away from it. And one of their critiques is that do hedge funds have this kind of investment not only in their communities, but in journalism writ large? And then, of course, there's the question of technology. What to do with the print product, for instance, right? Also, what to do about metric software. We're hearing a lot of times that you can use Google Analytics and you can use the American Press Institute's metrics for news. But what happens when the metrics are driving the reporting, right? What happens when you're only reporting the stories that get read or get shared a lot, and what's being missed? And I would hazard a guess that what's being missed is kind of civic reporting. And then again, there's a question of resources. So I just want to close off with some potential solutions. And I want to focus on one in particular, right? Which is about changing the narrative. And this is coming from Robert York, who is the publisher and editor-in-chief at The Morning Call, which is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And he says, we as an industry have done this tragic job of changing the perception that we are, grandma with one foot in the grave. And I think that the biggest thing we need to do right now as an industry is to beat back this perception that this is a bad industry to be part of, that it's a bad industry to be joining, it's a bad industry to bet on from a financial standpoint. Right? So what does this mean? It means that it is time to rewrite the story of local newspapers. Right? And this is something that we can all do, we can all be part of. It's not just for academics or those in the industry, it's for all of us. We need to rewrite the narrative around the newspaper industry, because it is not just one industry, but multiple industries, one of which, these small markets, have been sorely neglected. And I think it's time that we start filling in the blanks of this story. So thank you very much for your time.
One thing I'm sort of interested about being in a more conservative part of Oregon, being a smaller place, and obviously something else I've been talking so much with journalism is the rise of fake news, but I also know that that's something that's not been as relevant with local publications, given this sort of more nuanced connection with the community, but at the same time, having talked to people who worked there, I've heard that editors are super open to the sorts of stories that might not have been traditionally done in the community, but sometimes in response, the community isn't as receptive to those. So I'm wondering how you feel as a journalist, particularly as someone coming from outside of that area, how you can sort of touch on some of these more national issues that might not be as accepted in the community, but still regain that trust.
Right. That's a great question. And just to take a step back, I'm not a journalist. I'm not trained as a journalist. But I think this is where this idea of transparency can be really important, right? So if a newspaper is thinking about transitioning to stories that the community hasn't had access to, I think there's an opportunity just to be honest here. And hey, we're going to try this out, right? Again, thinking like if they are invested in the community, then they need to be saying, we're going to try this out and let's see how this goes. Right. What we do know is that newspapers can't just be doing the same thing over and over again, because that hasn't gotten them very far. Right. So saying we're going to try this more solutions-oriented approach. You know, something about fake news that maybe the smaller community newspapers can do are like digital literacy campaigns or media literacy campaigns. Stories on how do you know when a story is fake. Right. Doesn't necessarily have to be here are the trustworthy sources, but what are the tools that we can bring our community members to help them make these decisions ourselves? And I actually think that the small town newspapers, because they are trusted, have an opportunity to be kind of at the forefront of media literacy, which is something that, you know, I think we lack in the United States and elsewhere. So this idea of transparency, I think, is the important thing here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for taking your time to come and visit us today. My question would be that where do you see the future of newspaper of 7 generation ahead from now?
That's a great question. What do I think is the future of newspapers several generations? Well, I don't think it will happen in the printed product, although I would like to think that the printed product will remain kind of a niche thing, right? So maybe it is the Sunday edition, or maybe it's a once a month kind of, here's all the great stories we published this month, or maybe it's a magazine or something like that. Maybe I'm just nostalgic, but like I like holding, I read a newspaper once a week, a physical newspaper, right? So I do think that that, you know, one thing we're all going to have to get used to is we're moving into this kind of digital world. Canada, for instance, doesn't do checks anymore. You can't write a check. It's all done electronically. So, you know, we're moving away from the paper product. I think there's always going to be a need and a desire and a want for local news. I don't think that's as much in jeopardy as we think it is. Because at the very least, we always have to know if a road is closed, if a school is closed, you know, do we have classes today? Like, that's a local news story, right? And this stuff remains important because, like I said, we kind of remain in places. I don't think that the big publications are going to falter anytime soon. I think we're going to have the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal for a while. I am a little bit more worried about the major metro newspapers because they're the ones who are still struggling with trying to do everything but having a ton of competition. Right? So I'm wondering if we're going to see those either downsize or move away. But like I said, I think that we're always going to need news. And I say news rather than information because we're always going to need someone to digest it for us. Because I don't know about you, but I just get bombarded with information overload. And yes, you could go to the government website. And yes, you could go to the University of Oregon website and figure out if there's classes or if there's changes. But sometimes I just like having it come to me and someone else has done the work and I get to read the story because we do live our lives, our own narratives as well. So I think that the profession of journalism, as much as it's changing, I think that the storytelling function is still going to be really important. So I think we're going to see a lot of technological change. I don't know if we're going to see a lot of content change. But we are seeing a rise of, you know, Kevin Anderson just wrote a piece of maybe it's time to do away with the article format. Maybe that's too old school. Maybe it's more augmented reality and virtual reality and immersive journalism functions. So, but I'd like to think that they're going to exist as an ecosystem. We'll have stories, we'll have articles, but we'll also have the components as well. It's a very long answer to your question.
Thank you. Can I give you my input on this?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it's really funny to see that most of the people here do not see a future for newspaper, but then I'm from a different country, and then from where I'm from, people really demand the newspaper. Like they love it,
Yeah.
and then it's something that it's like the most important thing to have. So it's really funny to see that it's different here.
I think you raised an incredibly important point, and I think you pointed out a big flaw that I didn't say in my talk, which is that this is a really Western-focused talk, right? The crisis of journalism is the crisis of the newspaper is a Western phenomenon, right? Newspaper growth is huge in India, is huge in China and most of Asia, is huge on the continent of Africa, right? So what we're experiencing when we talk about this is sometimes when we have this kind of US-centric vision of media, right? That media is American and everything else is not media. And I think that's a great point, and I think that is something we need to be mindful of, because other media systems are going through now the golden age of the newspaper, not just journalism, but newspapers, and that's something we need to remember. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks to Chris Ali, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.